there kids, it's me, Mr. Creepypasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I want to let you know about a new book from tonight's author, T.W. Grimm. T.W. Grimm brings us A Different Kind of Magic, available now on Amazon, in the link in the description down below. Magic, often seen as wondrous and benevolent, but T.W. Grimm, a celebrated author of eerie no-sleep tales, offers a different kind of sorcery, one that pulls at the very threads of reality, weaving tales of terror and wonder. If you want to check out A Different Kind of Magic, check the link in the description down below. And now, on to tonight's story. It appears summer's decided to dig in its heels and stay a while this year. We're well into October, but the thermometer outside Henry's kitchen window is still hitting the mid-80s. It's what Henry refers to as a drag-ass summer. On the back porch clear to the edge of the horizon, the world's teetering on the brink of a great and sweeping renewal. Somewhere up around the next bend there's a hard frost waiting to coat the rooftops with a crystalline blanket of ice. But that day hasn't come just yet. For now, we are resigned to continue sweating it out beneath the waning sun of a drag-ass summer. The crops have been harvested, the barn has been freshly painted, and a team of roofers finished reshingling the old farmhouses a few weeks ago. With these last few tasks in the bag, Henry's just about ready to call it quits on the farm life. Henry will be moving to his new home soon. It's a retirement village with on-site medical facilities and a community center. Henry will be occupying one half of a tiny duplex, cozy little home with a postage stamp-sized yard and a white picket fence. There's an identical flower bed in front of each identical front porch. This is where Henry will spend the rest of his golden years. But that's in the future. For now, there's still time to do some bullshitting in the shade of the massive old trees that tower over Henry's yard. As for me, I've made my peace with the sale of the farm. It is what it is. There's nothing I can do except plop myself down in one of those wooden swing chairs, turn off my ringer, and enjoy these last few visits the best I can. It sucks. Sure does, but what can I say? It is what it is. In the meantime, I've been busy putting together a book of Henry's very best tales for publication, and it's been taking up most of my free time and energy. I think it has a decent shot at getting picked up by a publishing company, but I suppose I'm biased when it comes to Henry's stories. After all, they're awfully close to my own heart. On this particular day, Henry and I were both too hot and dispirited to do much talking. "Too fucking hot out for October," Henry grumbled. "You another can of that goat piss, would you? I'm drier than the Sahara over here." Henry was referring to the non-alcoholic beer we were both drinking these days. He refused to call it anything other than goat piss, and he wasn't wrong. You can defend it any way you want, but in my humble opinion, that stuff simply isn't very fucking good. It's just not the same. Sure thing, Henry. Can of goat piss coming up. I fished one out of the slushy ice in Henry's old cooler and passed it over. He popped the tab and drank with an exaggerated grimace of distaste. He isn't happy about quitting the booze, but he's sticking to it, and I'm proud of him. I'm proud of us both. I'm happy to say that Henry doesn't need that tab opener anymore. His hands have been working a lot better since the operation. We had actually just finished plinking away at a few cans with his old .22 revolver, an activity that would have been impossible before he went under the knife. The old fella's still a pretty good shot, too. 7 times out of 10, he hit the can dead center at a distance of 40 feet. The other 3 times, it's a little high or a little low, but he rarely misses. He's a much better shot than I am. And he likes to rub it in, of course. Uncle Henry is undoubtedly one of the greatest shit-talkers to ever grace the face of this planet. Henry tucked the .22 beneath his chair and grunted. "Tastes awful, but better than a kick in the ass, I suppose." I quipped, "Better than a kick in the liver, too," and fished out another one for myself. Henry and I are both on the wagon, and we're here to stay. Sobriety can be pretty dull, but I've lost 20 pounds. I feel a lot better, so I suppose it's not all bad. This new place. Gonna be a lot different, Henry muttered. And he drew his arms in a tight, angry X across his chest. Very different way of life over there. You can definitely say that. I don't know what I'm gonna do with myself, kiddo. They have all these groundskeepers and that they take care of the yard, so I can't even go out and mow that little patch of lawn. Christ's sake. I'm not allowed. Can you believe that shit? I shook my head in mock outrage and said, "Should hang around on your front porch and tell them they're doing it wrong." Henry flapped an angry hand at me and grunted, "Guess I'll have to take up some new hobbies. Cribbage or something. I don't know. What do you do to keep yourself busy in the city? You sit around in a coffee house with a bunch of other unemployed jackasses." I rolled my eyes and growled, "Unemployed? I'm a writer, Henry. I provide a service for money. It's called employment. Dusty old bastard." Henry grinned. "Well, that's maybe true. Tell me something." He leaned in close, and in a conspiratorial whisper, he asked, "Do you need to start any particular time in the morning, or is it just whenever you feel like crawling out of bed and strolling over to your desk?" I gave him the stink eye and shot back, "If you get bored sitting there in your little apartment now, I've heard knitting can be a good time killer. I mean, maybe you can knit me a sweater for Christmas." Henry snapped, "Maybe you can kiss my wrinkly old ass. How about that?" "It's not an apartment, dickhead. It's called a condominium." He shook his head at me and leaned back in his chair. "Way the hell too late for second thoughts, but I'm having them anyway." "Oh, you bet. All kinds of second thoughts." He waved his can at the vast expanse of the valley down below and added, "This has been my view for many, many years. Talk about a downgrade. See a little picket fence, old people wandering around like zombies, nurses knocking on my door asking if I need a laxative to help me shit. Jesus Christ, man, what a horror show." Henry let out a small, bitter laugh and took a gulp from his can. He grimaced and said, "It had to be done, though, didn't it? I'm just too goddamn old anymore. I don't even know how it happened. It was like I was your age just a few years ago. Now I'm old and Moses." I nodded down at my feet, blinking away a sudden film of excess moisture in my eyes. I said, "Time is treacherous ground, Henry. It crumbles under your feet. I wish there was something I could say to make it better, but there's not." "There's nothing you can say that'll make me any younger either," Henry grumbled. "That's what I need. 3 or 4 decades of my life back. What you looking at anyway? Trying to say something profound over here. You're staring off into the distance. Like I'm not even..." "Are you expecting some company, Henry?" I interrupted. "There's a car coming up the road." I pointed at a cloud of dust that was being churned up by the wheels of an approaching vehicle. It rolled up the steep gravel road and turned into Henry's driveway, a cream-colored Mercedes-Benz sedan that was probably worth well over $100,000. The Mercedes came to a smooth stop behind Henry's old truck and sat idling for a while. Henry and I stared at the luxury vehicle in silence. Then we looked at each other with similar expressions of confusion. Henry leaned closer to me and muttered, "I don't know a single soul drives on a machine like that. Good Christ, things gotta be worth more than both of us put together." A dark, sinister energy seemed to emanate from the Mercedes and thread itself into the humid air around us. I felt the hairs prickle up on the back of my neck. Henry's unexpected visitor was a bad person. I didn't have to meet them to know that they were rotten to the core. I didn't even have to see them. I could almost taste it in the air, sharp and bitter, rancid, psychic odor that made me feel faintly nauseous. The engine shut off, and a towering ogre of a man stepped out from behind the wheel. Despite the oppressive midday heat, the driver was dressed in a dark suit and matching tie. His eyes were obscured by a pair of mirrored sunglasses, and the rest of his face was an expressionless lump of stone. He lumbered around to open the rear passenger side door, bending down to offer a helping hand to an unseen presence inside. Another imposing figure slid out to stand beside him. It appeared to be a tall, heavy-set woman that was swathed from head to toe in multiple layers of black. She wore a long black dress, a black hat covered with a black veil, and her hands were clad in black leather gloves. I couldn't see her feet, but I could only assume there was a pair of ominous-looking black shoes hiding beneath the swirling curtain of her dress. I mumbled, "She looks like a shadow." And Henry cracked a humorless grin. "Yeah, maybe she is. I guess we'll find out." The sinister duo walked over to where we were sitting in the side yard, the hem of the woman's dress dragging along the dead lawn with a sound like a whisper in the muted hush of the drowsy afternoon. Her movements were almost disturbingly sinuous and fluid. Watching her approach made me feel anxious in a way I couldn't adequately describe. As she drew closer, I had to fight the urge to jump out of my chair and run like hell. Henry lifted a hand to our visitor and called out, "Afternoon, folks. How can I help you?" The driver asked, "Are you Henry?" And Henry absently nodded his head. The driver rumbled, "This is Madame Delilah. She came a very long way to be here, and she'd appreciate it if you could spare some time to talk with her today." Henry didn't answer. He was staring intently at the figure in black. A look of dawning comprehension was slowly spreading across his weathered features. His polite smile collapsed, and he folded his arms across his chest in an unwelcoming manner. I loudly cleared my throat to get the driver's attention. In a brisk and assertive tone of voice, I said, "Excuse me, sir, but what's the purpose of your visit today exactly?" The driver turned his head very slightly in my direction, and he growled, "If your name isn't Henry, Madame Delilah doesn't have any business with you, homie. Either keep quiet or take a walk. I'm not going to repeat myself." He stepped forward to loom over my chair, and I blinked up at my own reflection in his sunglasses. The driver was at least 6'4", and the broad, lumpy dome of his clean-shaven skull was mottled with ugly battle scars. The word Diablo was tattooed across his cheek in faded prison ink, and there was a fresher tattoo of a serpent on the back of his hand. He didn't look like a chauffeur. He looked like a hired goon. Quietly, Henry said, "He's my nephew. He can stay right where he is, thanks." The woman in black held up a hand to silence her minion, and she exclaimed in a little, lilting southern drawl, "This young man right here is your nephew. Well, if it isn't my lucky day, I have the pleasure of finally meeting not only one, but two of my long-lost relatives. Diego, be a dear and fetch us a couple of those folding chairs I saw leaning up against the back porch. The three of us here, we have ourselves a whole lot of catching up to do." With visible reluctance, Diego stepped out of my personal space and hustled over to grab the chairs. I shot a questioning look over at Henry, but he didn't seem to notice. He was still staring at the woman in black. Diego came hurrying back with the chairs clamped beneath his arm. He groaned, "Here's your chair, madam," in a reverential tone, and he executed a slight bow. The woman in black delicately patted his arm with a gloved hand, and she sank down into the chair with an unnaturally smooth, coiling grace that made me feel deeply uneasy. There was something wrong with the way she moved. Not wrong exactly, just strange. And why was she covered in multiple layers of black on such a hot day? Even in the shade, I was still actively sweating through my t-shirt. How could she even stand it? Our decidedly ominous visitor folded her hands neatly in her lap and said, "This is really something. It truly is. It's good to finally meet you, Henry. Do you know who I am?" Henry gave her a hesitant nod and answered, "You're my half-sister, ain't you?" "Guilty as charged. It's me, your long-lost sister Delilah. Live and in the flesh. Isn't that just something? I'd wager you weren't expecting that, were you?" Henry sat there for a moment, mulling over her words in his patient and orderly manner. He took a slow, unhurried sip from his can of non-alcoholic brew, then another. Then he said, "No, I wasn't expecting one of you to show up on my doorstep, but I knew there was some half-siblings floating around out there." The woman in black sat up straight in her brightly colored lawn chair. Slowly, she said, "Well, now is that a fact? How did you know that?" Henry and I glanced at each other, both of us affirming to the other that something was definitely off about the situation. Henry lit a cigarette and wheezed, "I hired a private detective agency to do some poking around a few years back. Seems Dad got into the bootlegging business and made himself a fortune. Married a few times, had some kids. died in his bed at a ripe old age. Looks like he led a pretty colorful life down there. Henry was visibly annoyed with both her mocking tone and the whole unwelcome situation in general. But we were both very curious of the unsettling presence of Diego, who was thrumming with a high-voltage undercut of barely suppressed violence. "Oh, he most certainly did lead a colorful life, Henry," Delilah agreed. "So is that it? Was that all the dirt your private eye was able to dig up? Tell the truth, Henry." "Diego doesn't like it when people lie to me. Do you, sugar?" "No," Diego replied. That was it. Just no. And a menacing stare. Henry and I glanced at each other again, silently urged Henry to play nice and cooperate. Henry isn't a reckless man by any means, but he also doesn't respond to intimidation very well. "Well," Henry muttered, "apparently he just sort of rambled his way around the country for a couple of years, doing odd jobs, boozing it up in taverns. Got tired of the working life after a while, so tried his hands being a con man. Called them grifters back then. A whole subculture of thieves and hoodlums. He'd wandered around from place to place, cheating, stealing from gullible folks who didn't know any better. Dad wasn't so good at it, I guess, because he got himself arrested in Boise. Got picked up again in Oakland, one more time in Houston. Pleaded guilty on that last fraud charge and spent 90 days on the work on the farm in Texas. Yes, he met your mother shortly after he was released." "My mother," Delilah said softly. "Are you aware that she operated a brothel? I was born there. Does that bother you?" Henry shook his head and held up his free hand in a placating gesture. He said, "I'm aware of the nature of her business. I pass no judgment on it." Delilah snapped. "I wouldn't care if you did, Henry. Frankly, I don't care what any man thinks." Henry gave her a ghost of a grin and said, "I don't care what any man thinks either. Anyway, I don't know exactly what happened between Dad and your mom, but they ended up getting divorced, and I was told one of your siblings died in an accident. The PI wasn't too clear on what happened." "An accident," Delilah repeated. "Yeah, I suppose you could say that. It was terrible, awful, horrible accident." There was a brief and uncomfortable silence. The woman in black folded her hands in her lap, her head lowered as she pondered what to say next. She murmured, "After he left my mother, our father drifted to Ohio, charmed himself into the arms of another unsuspecting woman. When it was over, he moved to Nevada, got hitched for a fourth time in Reno. They purchased a nice suburban home, lived a quiet life, and that's where he died. He gasped his last breath on September 8th, 1985, and may he burn in hell for all eternity." Henry pursed his lips and said, "Can't say I disagree with that statement. Pardon my language, but the man was a grade A bastard. Real poor excuse for a human being." Delilah waved off his apology and let out a dry chuckle. She said, "I've lived a very interesting life. I can assure you I'm no stranger to vulgarity." She pointed at the can in Henry's hand and said, "Now, in my experience, there's only one reason why a working man would ever lower himself to drink a non-alcoholic brew. Are you a recovering drunkard, Henry? Alcoholism does run in the family, though, doesn't it? Our father was a terrible drunk. How about our nephew over here? Is he on the wagon, too? Oh, that's good. Very happy for both of you." Henry was growing visibly annoyed with his unannounced visitor and her caustic demeanor. He tightened his jaw and muttered, "Rather not talk about it if you don't mind. I did it for health reasons." "Oh yes, I heard about the cancer," Delilah cooed. Then I could almost see her malignant smile bloom behind her veil. "Such an awful disease, that cancer. I'm glad you recovered, Henry. Good on you."
"Yeah, good on me,"
Henry quietly agreed. His eyes glittered like chips of ice, cold and hard. He paused to ruminate on his next course of action, then leaned down to rummage around beneath his chair. He came up holding his .22 revolver, which he promptly cocked, and pointed straight at Diego's large, clean-shaven skull.
"Oh, I hate to be impolite," he sighed, "but I won't tolerate any more implied threats today, not from you or this gentleman beside you. State the purpose of this visit. Get yourselves the ever-loving fuck off my land.
I gaped at the revolver and gasped, "Holy shit, Henry, what are you doing?" Diego coiled for action in his chair, but Delilah put a staying hand on his shoulder and snorted, "My stars. Is that how you treat your own kin, Henry? Kick them off your land at gunpoint?"
"I don't know you from a hole in the ground," Henry snapped. "Now tell me why you're here and bugger off down the road."
Diego growled,
"Get the gun off me, old man, for I take it from you."
Henry stared back at him, calm and unafraid, and he said,
"Won't be the first body I've buried on this farm. Go ahead and try it."
Delilah murmured, "Diego, I'm only saying this once. Stand down." She started to pull off one of her gloves. He didn't even hear her softly spoken command, and neither did Henry. They were almost laser-focused on each other, the tough young thug and the hardened old farmer. Both of them were accustomed to danger, and neither one was willing to back down. I croaked, "Henry, put the gun down." And Diego nodded in agreement.
"Listen to your nephew, old-timer. Get the gun off me and hand it over. I'll shoot you dead, young fella."
"That's a fact," Henry assured him.
"I'm old and I'm tired and I don't give a shit no more."
Diego started to stand up, but Delilah grabbed his hand before he could go any further. Her bodyguard froze in place like a statue, instantly transformed into an aggressive-looking mannequin, unmoving and unblinking. The seconds ticked by while Henry and I sat there and stared at this bizarre spectacle in disbelief. Both of us struggling to process what we were seeing. Henry exclaimed,
"Jesus Christ! What'd you do to him?"
Delilah ignored his question. She lightly smacked her paralyzed lackey in the face with her glove and purred, "What do you think you're doing? You don't make a move unless I say so, and don't you forget it." I watched in horrified fascination as a long stream of drool dripped over Diego's bottom lip and trailed down his chin. His face was a motionless mask behind his mirrored sunglasses. He didn't move a muscle, not even a single twitch of a finger. It was as if he'd been carved from stone, an eccentric art exhibit for an unlikely audience of 3. I saw that he was starting to turn a dark shade of red, and I clearly ventured, "Ma'am, I don't think he can breathe." "No, sir, he cannot," Delilah agreed, and she gave Diego another smack in the face with her glove. "If I require your services, Diego, I'll be sure to let you know. Until then, you can sit tight and look handsome for me, sugar. You understand?" Delilah snapped the back of his neck with her bare fingertip. Almost immediately, her bodyguard started gasping for breath. He collapsed into his chair and panted like a dog in heat, coughing and gagging with tears in his eyes. There was a look of sheer terror on his face. I didn't blame him one bit. It was bad enough to watch it happen. I couldn't imagine what it must have felt like. The woman in black let out a loud, dramatic sigh and declared, "That will be enough from all of you. It's done. Henry, be a peach. Put your gun back under your chair. You don't need it anymore." Henry placed the gun in his lap and patted it with his free hand.
"No," he said. "Don't believe I will. You can stay right here until you're gone."
He looked over at Diego and grudgingly asked him,
"You need some water, kid? You don't look so good."
Delilah's veil swayed back and forth as she angrily shook her head. "No, thank you, Henry," she said briskly. "He doesn't need any water. He needs to mind himself and stop acting like a big man to impress me. I'm definitely not impressed, Diego. Not one bit. Anyhow, to answer your question, Henry, I came all this way to ask you a question. Are you familiar with a condition called the Medusa disorder? More specifically, do you know if anyone on your side of the family has ever been diagnosed with this condition?" Henry slowly shook his head.
"No, I don't believe so. Never heard of such a thing. What is it?"
Delilah visibly relaxed beneath her voluminous layers of black. She murmured, "Maybe I'm the only one left." "That would be a wonderful thing, really would," to Henry. She said, "Oh, well, the Medusa disorder is, well, it's a curse, a blessing, and a nightmare, all rolled into one. My doctors believe it may have been hereditary, but they're not really sure. It's extremely rare. Mama said Father always claimed he'd never heard of it before. But knowing him, he could have been lying through his teeth. He's very fond of telling lies. It was his favorite pastime. Delilah started to pull her glove back on, and I finally noticed that her hand was deformed. I only saw it for a split second, but it was long enough to make my heart lurch in my chest. Her palm appeared to be abnormally small, making her fingers seem far too long in comparison. They looked like a nest of smooth, pallid little snakes. The very thought made me squirm a little in my chair. I didn't like snakes. It's the way they move, I think. It creeps me out. If Delilah noticed my reaction, she didn't acknowledge it. She turned to Henry and said, "Let me tell you something about our dear father. He was an awful man, but he could be very charming when he wanted something. He was dark-haired and handsome. His looks and his accent reminded people of Bela Lugosi, and women just loved him to death. He could talk his way into just about anything, that man. So here he comes, swaggering into my mama's establishment, fresh from the barber shop, with $55 in his wallet and a nasty little plan rolling around in his head. He slipped a crisp dollar bill into the doorman's pocket and said, 'Sir, I would like to sit down and have a drink with the madam. I've heard she's the most beautiful woman in the world.' Delilah flapped a hand in the air and said, 'Unfortunately, the harsh truth is that my mother was not a lovely woman. The poor dear had a face like a French bulldog and a body to match. Her only saving grace was being born into wealth. Imperfection is the subject of much ridicule in those circles, even more so when you're a woman. Mama had a lonely childhood. She spent her youth languishing away in her father's stuffy old mansion. If it weren't for the kindness of their servants, she wouldn't have had a friend in the world. Such a shame. Mama had a good heart. She deserved as much happiness as anyone else in the world.' 'Well, at least she didn't grow up hungry,' Henry observed. 'If you asked me, that's a hell of a lot worse.' 'Well, I'm not interested in listening to your folksy moralizing, Henry,' Delilah interrupted. 'All people can know suffering, be they old or young, rich or poor. You see, wealthy circles are ruled by wealthy men, and wealthy men see women as accessories. You know, kind of like an expensive watch or a luxury car. Unattractive women are perceived as having no worth at all, even if they're filthy rich themselves. It's a dreadful culture, and I wish the whole lot of them would build a rocket ship and launch themselves into orbit. Just blast off into space and never return. Sounds good to me.' Delilah absently reached out to rest her hand on Diego's arm, an unconscious gesture of dominance and ownership. The hulking bodyguard let out an involuntary whimper and shrank away from her touch. 'Oh, don't be like that,' she scolded him. 'I'd never hurt you without reason. Such a drama queen. Anyhow, Mama took some of that inheritance money and bought an old playhouse, one that was on the verge of bankruptcy. She closed it down, had it renovated by a team of master craftsmen. She named her new business venture the All-Star Texas Review. And oh my goodness, I'll tell y'all something. That place wasn't just the grandest cat house in all the South. It was the grandest establishment of any kind at all.' Henry smiled a little and said, 'No, I wouldn't know about any of that. You want to talk about corn? Well, I'm your man.' Delilah laughed and exclaimed, 'Farmers are the glue that hold this country together.' No shame in that. Personally, I find the whole process fascinating. Tell me, is it difficult to operate a harvester? They're so very intimidating. It looks like it would be hard work to wrestle one of those things around in a field.' 'Not these days,' Henry snorted. 'New ones all got that GPS tracking. You hardly even have to hold on to the wheel anymore. Yeah, I remember way back in, must have been right around that time that I frowned at Henry and said, 'Don't get him started, ma'am. He'll never stop. Please, continue. I want to hear this.' 'Thank you, sugar,' Delilah purred. So as it came to pass, Mama made a fortune and reinvented herself. All at the same time, she went from being a sad little wallflower to a stuffy old mansion to hosting the wildest parties in town every single night. Mama always had a fondness for theater. and her live productions put the review head and shoulders above the rest. There was burlesque and erotic theater, vaudeville and magicians, and just all kinds of live entertainment. Mama always referred to the ladies who worked there as the talent. They really were quite talented. They could sing and play instruments, they could act, and a lot of them could dance just like professional ballerinas. But most importantly, they could empty a man's pockets and send him off with a smile on his face. And he'd come back time and time again. Not only would he come back, he'd bring all of his friends along with him. Mama charged $50 just to walk in the door. And that was a lot of money in those days. Oh yeah. The entertainment came dear at the review, but it was always worth the price.
Sounds like she carved herself a cozy little niche in this world, Henry said. Can't find any fault in that.
She had a good thing, Delilah agreed. Very good thing. And then our dear father swaggered through the door, smashed it all to pieces. They could almost taste the bitterness in her words, sour and acidic. She obviously harbored a deep, ingrained, and long-standing hatred for her father, the kind that smoldered away in the pit of a person's soul forever. Now you have to remember that not one single guest had ever requested to sit and have a drink with my mother. Never once in the whole 5 years the review had been open for business. So they sat in the lounge, and he turned on that old world charm. All night long. All her bodyguards knew he was a con man with bad intentions, but all they could do was stand back and glare at him. Mama was hopelessly swept off her feet. They got married exactly 26 days later. Everyone could see what was happening. Everyone except Mama, of course. He was the one, and that was that. You simply cannot reason with someone who's caught in the throes of their first love.
Yeah, love really can be blind, Henry agreed. Sometimes it works out for the better, not very often.
Delilah grumbled. Oh, and she was blind, all right. Our father played the part of the starry-eyed husband, but only when she was paying attention. It was obvious he despised her, but he couldn't show it to her face. Not yet. Not until the time was right. About 5 months after the wedding, Mama got pregnant with my older sister, Lucille. It was a difficult pregnancy. She was confined to her bed for the majority of her last trimester. So she granted my father power over her management responsibilities. Right away, he fired all of her security staff. He replaced them with a bunch of ruffians who were loyal only to him. And after that, he started firing anyone who even looked at him wrong. Just pointed at the door and said, "Get out." They're probably folks who'd never bothered to hide their distaste for him. I'd imagine Father had a very frail ego. Once he had the majority of their employees under his thumb, he pulled up a chair beside Mama's bed and talked her into making him a senior partner in the review. He demanded a 60-40 split, just kept arguing the poor, sick woman until she gave in and signed the documents. It was the second biggest mistake she ever made. Henry asked.
What was the biggest mistake?
He thought about it for a second and added,
Marrying him, I suppose.
Her biggest mistake, Delilah growled, was not allowing her bouncers to take him back and kick his brains out of his ears. By the time she might have even considered this an option, it was far too late. So by the time Lucille came around, Father basically owned the review and everyone who worked there. My Mama became a prisoner in her own home. She was always surrounded by his hired goons, and she couldn't go anywhere without his approval. He'd openly mock and degrade his own wife in front of their employees, but when they were behind closed doors, it was even worse. He would fly into a drunken fury over nothing at all and start hitting her. Sometimes he'd beat her up so badly, she wouldn't be able to show her face for weeks at a time. Henry shook his head grimly and said,
Sounds an awful lot like Wally. Being a worthless shithead must be a genetic trait.
Perhaps it is, Delilah agreed. At any rate, now that he was in control, Father got the bright idea to diversify their portfolio, so to speak, and he got into the bootlegging business. It wasn't long before he was selling his hooch clear across the state and even beyond. He became very rich and powerful in a short period of time, but it was never enough. The money, the influence, none of it could ever soothe the burning fury in his heart. If anything went wrong, it was automatically Mama's fault. If a business deal fell through, it was Mama's fault. If one of his floozies got tired of his drunken rages and broke off their affair, it was Mama's fault. If it started raining, it was Mama's fault. And if it didn't rain, well, that was her fault too. He'd use any excuse at all to belt her in the mouth just to make himself feel a little more in control. A drunk and a wife beater, Henry observed dryly. And he shook his head. They go hand in hand. It's learned behavior, Delilah replied curtly. Probably grew up watching his daddy do the same thing. Anyway, Father never cared much for Lucille, partly because she was a girl, but also because she looked more like Mama than him. He wanted a boy, a legitimate son to carry on his name, so he started forcing himself on Mama whenever he was drunk enough to get over his disgust for her. And eventually, she got pregnant again. And this time it was a boy. He loved his new son, much as a cold bastard like him could love another human being, I guess. His name was Charlie, and he'd dress him up in these tiny little suits, just like one of his mobster buddies. He always said Charlie would take over the family business one day, but what he really meant was his business. Mama was no longer a factor in any decisions he made. She was a prisoner, an incubator, and a punching bag. Nothing more. I could feel that malignant smile pop up behind Delilah's veil again. She sighed. Well, it was inevitable that dear old Dad would eventually get caught up in his illegal activities. Sure enough, federal agents arrested him outside of a barber shop. They charged him with tax evasion, bootlegging, racketeering, and a whole grocery list of other nefarious deeds. When Father got out on bail, he started drinking as soon as he got into the limousine that was waiting for him outside of the jailhouse. He went straight back to the review and got blackout shit-ass drunk at the bar. He just sat there for hours, getting drunker and drunker, angrier and angrier. And who was he angry with? Who was to blame for all of his troubles? Mama, she said softly. That's who. It was all her fault. He hauled her out of bed by the hair and beat her up so badly there was blood spatters on the ceiling. Henry wrinkled his nose in disgust and grumbled, A piece of work. Jesus. No, Delilah countered. I don't believe Jesus was there. Not that night. Father beat her until she was unconscious, and then he hurt her in other ways. He left her crumpled up on the floor, and a maid found her lying there in the morning. She ran downstairs hollering that the madam had been murdered. That's how bad it was. The maid thought she was dead, and muttered, I agree with Henry. What a piece of shit. Oh, it gets even worse, Delilah grimly assured me. Mama had broken bones and internal bleeding, but Father wouldn't let her go to a hospital. His mobster friend set him up with a doctor who had come to see her in the penthouse. The doctor was a gambling addict who was trying to work off his debts. He did what he could with the resources available to him, but Mama never fully recovered. To complicate things even more, the attack had left her pregnant again. And this time, it was me. Henry and I were quiet as we absorbed this information. Gently, Henry said, Suppose you're right after all. Rich or poor, everyone suffers. Yes, sir, they do, Delilah agreed. Now, Mama could feel there was something different about this pregnancy, but no one would pay her any mind. When she went into labor, they called in the doctor. He performed the delivery right there in her bedroom. When the doctor got his first good look at me, he let out a scream and dropped me onto the bed. The nurse fainted, dead away, and fell like a stone onto the floor. Father tried to come in and see what the hell was going on, but the doctor blocked him from coming through the door. He said I was horribly deformed, and he doubted I would live for very long. He asked permission to euthanize me immediately, or in his words,
We'll both be damned. My father pushed his pistol in the doctor's stomach and told him, "Get out of the way or get yourself shot." When he saw me lying there on the bloody sheets, he turned white as a ghost and said, "God in heaven, this thing is a monster. Do what you have to do, Doc, and we'll bury it tonight." Mama started screaming at them not to hurt her baby, but the doctor pulled off his gloves and filled a needle with enough morphine to kill me on the spot. He told her, "Hush now, woman. This isn't murder, it's a mercy." Mama begged him to stop, but Father pinned her to the bed while the doctor knelt down to do his dirty work. And as soon as his bare fingertips touched my skin, he froze up like an icicle and fell onto the floor. The nurse tried to revive him, but his heart was locked up tighter than a fist inside his chest. He was dead within minutes. I muttered, "Holy shit." And Henry solemnly nodded in agreement. "Holy shit, indeed, dear nephew," Delilah said. Father didn't know what had just happened, but he knew that he wasn't in a hurry to get close to me. Instead, he called in some of his goons and asked one of them to pick me up. When his lackey got over his shock at my appearance, he tried to scoop me up and instantly froze in place, not blinking, not breathing, just standing there, hunched over the bed with drool sliding over his lips. Something finally clicked in Father's brain. He told the others, "This thing is venomous. Put on a pair of gloves before you handle it." Now, none of them wanted to deal with me while I was still alive, so they stuck me into a shoebox and put me in the attic to suffocate in the dark. Mama begged Father to stop, but her pleading fell on deaf ears. So she waited until he and his men left to dispose of the other bodies in the penthouse suite. While they were gone, a couple of chambermaids helped her climb those steep stairs, and she nursed me by candlelight. She sat there on the floor with her poisonous child cradled to her breast, and no harm came to her, because I was her, and she was me. I suppose if she hadn't been immune to my toxins, I probably would have killed her in the womb. But we were one flesh, and one blood, and we were safe together. She washed me and held me close, and in the wavering glow of the candles, she named me Delilah. The chambermaids didn't approve, but she told them every man thinks he's a Samson, doesn't he? I hope my baby girl proves to be the downfall of some arrogant bastard like my husband. Yes, I dearly hope so. When Father got back from his errand in the desert, he was furious Mama had saved me from dying in that shoebox. He threatened to kill her right then and there. She cradled me close to him and told him, "Go ahead, you rotten bastard, kill me, and kill her too. I'll be waiting for you in hell." He saw the fire in her eyes, and he knew that she was telling the truth. So he went downstairs to hide in the bottle, cowering behind the liquor like the weak man that he was. When he came back a few hours later, he told her, "Go ahead and keep it alive, if that's what you really want, but it stays up here in the attic. I don't want to see it ever again, and if I do, I'll shoot it right between the eyes." And do you know what Mama said to him? She said, "That's fine by me, because I'd rather burn this place to the ground than let you anywhere near this precious baby girl. I'd burn it down in the middle of the night, and we'd burn right along with it, you and me both. I mean what I say, you evil son of a bitch, and don't you forget it." Delilah turned to her bodyguard and said, "My throat's getting a tad dry over here, my dear. Can you fetch me a drink from the car?" Diego hustled over to the Mercedes and popped open the trunk. He came back holding a metal flask and a straw. Delilah accepted it with a quiet "Thank you, sugar," and the straw disappeared beneath her veil. Oh, it's much better. Anyway, I spent the first 7 years of my life living in the attic of the Bordello. Mama had a separate room built, and she turned it into a nursery. And that's where I existed for every second of every hour, day in and day out. Mama would divide her time between me and the other children downstairs. When I was still very little, she started draping me in a veil so my appearance wouldn't disturb the nanny too much. She was a nice old woman who always wore a pair of thick rubber gauntlets when she came to take care of me. I was never told her real name. I just called her Nanny. Now, I knew I wasn't allowed to touch people, but I didn't understand why. Mama would tell me because you'll hurt someone if you touch them. But I was just too young to understand. Then Annie would sing songs and play games with me, but she never held me close or stroked my hair when I was sad. I would whine and beg for physical attention, but Nanny always stepped away and told me it was too dangerous. I remember I was acting like a little brat one day, as children do, and I tried to touch the nanny's face while she was tying my shoes. Well, that wonderful, kindly old woman slapped my hand and shoved me away with her foot. I fell down and banged the back of my head on the floor. I started to cry, and Nanny yelled, "Don't you ever touch me, ever! Do you want me to die?" I cried and cried my poor little heart out, and all she could do was stand there and cry along with me. She apologized over and over again, but there was a look of terror in her eyes. And there was something else, too. It was loathing. That sweet, kind old woman loathed me with all of her heart. Henry started to look a tad misty-eyed. I'll admit that despite my own general distaste of my new aunt and her disturbing presence, I was beginning to feel a little choked up myself. I cleared my throat and said, "I'm really sorry these things happened to you and your mom. I wish there was more I could say." Delilah took another sip from her flask and said, "Thank you kindly. Unfortunately, I'm just getting started over here." Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. And if you're not listening to tonight's episode of the podcast, then you can on Spotify or other places that people listen to podcasts, because I only use Spotify. And if you're not watching tonight's video, then you can on YouTube and nowhere else, because that's the only place I upload videos. And if you've done both of those things, then I want to say thank you for subscribing and clicking that like button and leaving a comment that's nice and friendly that I can respond to and give a little heart to. A big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Jakob Fenske, Stephanie Butler, Jordan Humble, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, William Wellington, Emma, Brenna, LaQueda Canizales, Smiley the Psychotic, Dante Kinkade, SimbasBloodyMojo, Mephistopheles, CursepoxPrimarch, Bastion Beefcake, M, Jesus Corneo, Yargul, Clownable, Amber Clark, Jay Kearns, Dakota Lane Whetstone, Himbo Jerry, Crusader Chocobo, Adamarius, Estebean, Nate Cull, Our Minsect Time, Xylobones, Angelus, Seclude, Salty Surprise, Lebeda Galvin, That Creepy Chick, Red Shadow Cat, Turtleman, Cryolinian, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Ika Limchalk, Dirty Diver 030, Matt Bach, Voice of Sand, Pikeamel, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Darth Miver, Sashi Suzaku, Coconut 509, Stricket, Freddy Krueger, Lisa Cottrell, Hades Nephew, Acid System, Mog, Kiwi the Sloth, Fester's Lampshade, Nico Kyle, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. To all of you guys, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you for being a huge support to me. Thank you to everybody who's in the description down below, and thank you to everyone who can even support $1 just on Patreon to help keep the content coming.